Something that's very helpful for doing that rhythmic variation, you could take those 4 sets, you could do the swung rhythm, you could do its inversion, you could do the groups of 4, which are maybe even more applicable, 2/8 and a quarter. You could do the inverse, a quarter and 2/8. Hi, thanks for clicking on this video, or if you're at the YouTube channel, welcome. My name is Kevin Alderman Jr. I'm a pianist and an organist. I've been thinking about this YouTube channel lately. I've got a few videos that have gotten some views. I'm coming up on just about 100 subscribers here. And I was wondering if I could use this channel as for something better than just old performances and a storage space. So I put together some practice strategies for pianists or just anybody interested in learning something new. There's 3 of them. They're not totally separate. They're definitely interrelated, and I think they could help you also take that step from being a beginning or an intermediate pianist to being able to play more difficult, advanced organ or piano repertoire. So my first point is experimentation and variation in your practice. When I was younger, for example, I had several really bad habits that would always show up during my own practicing. And there's one specific bad habit that caused me a lot of problems, and I think still causes a lot of problems for pianists right at that intermediate level who are starting to approach more advanced repertoire. And it's this idea of just incrementally increasing your practice tempo when you start working on a new passage, despite the fact that you've only ever really used one specific motion or technique for that passage. The problem is, if this technique isn't the most ideal or efficient one for a certain passage in the music, then when you gradually bring that passage up to tempo, you could end up with a lot of inconsistency, inaccuracy, or just discomfort. It could hurt. So I think the most straightforward solution here and kind of overall recommendation throughout this video is going to be more experimentation and variation in your practice. Now, there are several different sort of branches underneath that big umbrella of variation, but I really just want to focus on 2 of the most significant ones, rhythmic variation and variation in your note grouping. These are both great options if you're struggling to maintain evenness or accuracy, especially throughout a passage of scales or arpeggios. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to use the D flat major scale. I'm going to show you the difference between the 2. There are 4 rhythms I use very often in my own practice, a grouping of 3, a grouping of 4, and both of their inversions. So on the D flat major scale, starting with a swing rhythm, and its inversion, in contrast to groups of 4, such as 2/8 followed by a quarter, or a quarter followed by 2/8. I found these to be most effective when I spent a good amount of time only doing those rhythmic variations before jumping back to the rhythm written in the music. Now, as for grouping, taking the rhythm back as it is in the score, I think we most commonly divide scales into groups of 4. Because that's how the notes are beamed together on the page usually, but of course we can divide them into other arbitrary groups, like groups of 3, groups of 2, groups of 5, or groups of 6. I'm using that long-short articulation in part to make it more obvious to you as a listener how I'm grouping the notes, but also because I often do experiment with different articulations when the goal is evenness or consistency. So for a couple examples in context, I'm going to use 2 Chopin excerpts. For rhythmic variation, for example, the Sonata in B-flat minor, second movement, it's opus 35. There's this section where you need to play triads ascending in first inversion. You get to use both hands. That was a point of struggle for me, especially when I first started learning this sonata. Something that's very helpful for doing that rhythmic variation, you could take those 4 sets, you could do the swung rhythm, do its inversion. You could do the groups of 4, which are maybe even more applicable, 2/8 and a quarter. You could do the inverse, a quarter and 2/8. For the other side of it, note grouping, I'm going to use the Ocean Etude, Opus 25, number 12. It goes like this. You may be familiar with it, maybe not, but the most important thing to remember here is that it's arpeggios. It's all just... The most helpful strategy for me when I first started learning this, after spending so much time practicing it in groups of 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, I tried putting it into groups of 4, actually as it's beamed in the music in this case, but for the sake of variation from how I was practicing it, and it made a huge difference. Now remember, this idea of variation in your practice is sort of the overarching theme, compared to these two smaller things that I want to point out. The first being emphasis on a good fingering. So that same excerpt, the Chopin Sonata in B-flat minor, movement 2, if you spend time trying a thumb on a black key, for example, compared to my preferred fingering, which is letting your longer fingers push up to the black keys while letting your thumb and your pinky stay behind, you're going to get a totally different result. There's times where you're trying to bring this passage up to tempo and you don't realize that the problem is something creative in terms of fingering that you hadn't thought about before. The left hand I'm not worrying about here because the left hand is just a chromatic scale. Another huge thing I want to point out, a huge practice strategy, is the practice tempo. We spend so much time going straight from very slow practice for an entire passage to very quick practice for that same passage. We go along this sort of linear scale. We forget that we can take very small chunks and experiment with quick motions, this sort of impulse muscle movement, to see if the fingering that we're using, like I said, they're all interrelated, to see if the fingering that we're using is going to work up to tempo. For example, if, back to that D-flat major scale, you're trying to play... Right? If you need to see that fingering is going to work, of course it's just the fingering for a scale, I know in this case, you can check by doing this impulse motion up until the crossover, the change of your hand position. These smaller, quick motions are going to tell you whether or not that fingering is going to work. Before you spend all this time working the entire passage, where this could only be a part of it in context, the entire passage, bringing it up to tempo and then finding out that this one section is never clean. Another practice strategy that I use very often. So I want to close this video with sort of an obvious disclaimer. These practice strategies have been really helpful for me, and I've had very specific problems that have come up as I've tried to make that journey from being an intermediate pianist or even a beginning pianist to trying to play some of the more advanced repertoire. I'm totally individual, as are you, and the problems that you have now may or may not be solved with these strategies or variations of these strategies. That being said, at least you have more sort of tools that you can use when you're trying to figure out that problem that just can't get solved. And if this sort of video is something that you enjoyed, you could subscribe, and I'll see what the reaction is and whether or not I should post more technical help like this. Regardless, thank you for watching.